Hello and welcome back to another video exploration of the story. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I'm presenting these videos weekly as a companion to a Bible study that we are doing within my congregation called The Story, or based on the story. Kind of looks like that in its first printing anyway. New cover looks a little different. The story is a condensed biblical narrative put together by a guy named Randy Frazee. And it really takes the narrative portions, the story portions, hence the title, from the beginning of Genesis all the way through to the end of Revelation, and it brings it kind of down and presents it almost like a novel, kind of in that sense of what's going on. And then there's some summaries for some of the portions that are skipped over that kind of summarizes what's going on within the narrative in different portions. Now, this particular week, after a little bit of a snafu last week where we covered two different chapters due to my error, we were back into a single chapter this week, chapter 18, which is entitled Daniel in Exile. Now, this is the story quite familiar, I think, to many people. We hear about Daniel, who's best known for being in the lion's den, as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who get thrown into the fiery furnace because they all refuse to bow down to a different god besides God. So that is kind of the focal point of this particular chapter. And as I mentioned, it's found in the Old Testament book of Daniel. Now, Daniel is an interesting book from the standpoint that it contains both narrative as well as prophecy. It's a fairly short book. It's only 12 chapters long, quite a bit shorter than some of the other prophetic books that we have kind of taken a look at so far, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, some of those really like big major prophets they're called. Daniel could probably be considered one of the minor prophets as it's not super long, but that's kind of where this is found. Now, as I mentioned, the book itself is 12 chapters long. Now, the narrative, and particularly what's covered in our chapter of the story, takes up the first the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel, and then chapters 7 through 12 are the more prophetic bent of Daniel's prophecy. So that's kind of the background of where we find it for this particular portion or this particular week. Some background as to when it is going on. Daniel occurs during the Babylonian captivity. Now, the Babylonian captivity began, there's a couple of different sources. Some say either the year like 605 BCE, and some say like 587, right about the year 600 BCE. So about 600 years before Jesus is kind of where that begins. And the Babylonian captivity lasts for about 70 years. And Daniel, the figure, the person, was apparently active throughout the course of that entire captivity. So he would have been quite young when the captivity occurred, probably early teens, maybe even younger than that. But he would have been fairly young, and was a part of the group that was hauled off to Babylon. Now, during the captivity, both the Babylonian captivity as well as the Assyrian captivity that happened about 100 or so years before that, the people were taken off into various parts of the conquering empire and settled there. And it's usually the prominent people, like officials and military people, things of that nature. Take the leaders, those who have the capability of leadership, take them off and split them up, and you will really minimize the possibility that they will band together and try and rise up against you. That was the mentality of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So that's when this is going on, and it picks up basically right when the captivity starts. Now, according to the information that we have, Nebuchadnezzar is the king or the emperor of Babylon, and he has just become the ruler when the captivity begins. So essentially, like, he becomes king right at the same time that this whole group of Jewish people are being brought there. One of the first things that he decrees is take some of the young men who are intelligent and handsome and train them, educate them for 3 years and give them a portion of food from the king's table, food and drink, and we will educate them and we will bring them into the royal court. Among them is Daniel and also Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are part of this group too. And we don't know how big the group is, but these four are the standouts. And even of the four, Daniel is the big standout. So right away, we hear that Daniel does not want to defile himself with food from the king's table. And we don't know if that's because of the type of food it is. They're still under Jewish dietary law at that time, or if it's because it's the foreign power, it's the enemy. They don't want to defile themselves with that which is granted by the enemy. We don't exactly know, but either way, he says, I don't want to be defiled with it. So the first thing we hear is that he asks his the person who has charge over them, just give me vegetables, and the other three guys as well. They must kind of be in a little bit of a group there, but just give us vegetables, do it for 10 days, and see if we're faring better than everyone else. And lo and behold, 10 days later, they're looking better, so they continue to do that. So this is kind of the first little snippet there, and we hear even after that God grants these four guys wisdom, and it's very reminiscent of Solomon asking for God to grant great wisdom. They have great understanding of what they're being educated in, and then we hear that Daniel himself, out of the four, receives the ability to interpret dreams. Very, very, very reminiscent of Joseph back in Egypt, way back at the tail end of the book of Genesis. So this is another situation where we kind of see the cycle. We kind of hear about history repeating itself, even as things continue to move forward. And Daniel's story is definitely very reminiscent of the story of Joseph in Egypt, being the foreigner who rises up through the ranks despite opposition within the position of slavery, within the position of a foreign power. So very, very reminiscent that way. So that happens, and we hear that the four guys are distinguished and are brought into the royal court. Daniel himself remains within the royal court, and the other three kind of become very important overseers. They're important. Their importance within the government is established. One thing that we see about Daniel in particular but the other three guys as well, is that they navigate this foreign situation very, very well. Daniel in particular, he's very humble. He pays homage to those in power, but he plays his cards very, very well. And the only thing that he does not do, and the other three guys as well, the only thing that they do not do is bow down to the foreign gods. That's the one thing that apparently they will not compromise. And they're respected for that by some. Others don't like that they won't do that, and it gets actually all four of them in trouble, as we'll hear about momentarily. But so that's kind of what is going on. And as I mentioned before, Daniel is active throughout the course of this entire captivity. Now, historically, what is also going on is we've got the Babylonians who had conquered the Assyrians, which I mentioned a little bit ago. And then towards the end of this 70-year period, the Persians, or the Medes and the Persians, Medio-Persian sometimes it's called, maybe it sounds like it's probably one empire, they come in and conquer the Babylonians. And that's when we transfer and we start hearing about King Cyrus, and he's also called Darius. Some scholars think that those are two different people. Perhaps Darius was just a high-ranking official. Others think that Cyrus and Darius are just two names for the same guy. But so the Persians come in, and we see that go on as well. Now, backtracking now, so the four guys have stood out among the rest of their peers who were brought in for this educational time. And all of a sudden, as the chapter itself begins, King Nebuchadnezzar, emperor of the Babylonians, has had this dream, and he doesn't know what to make of it. And so he starts asking all of his advisors, all of his wise men, magi's, magicians, whatever you want to call them, says, tell me my dream and then interpret it for me. And they're all like, we can't tell you what your dream is. We're not that wise. No one can do this. The only one who can do this is a God and they do not dwell among mortals. That particular statement really jumped out at us, and we focused on that for a little bit. Their understanding is completely different from the Jewish understanding, as well as ours today, that we have a God that dwells among mortals. Just before the Babylonian captivity, when before the temple was wiped out, which it was by the Babylonians, God dwelled in the temple. Prior to the temple, God dwelled in the tabernacle. God dwelled among mortals, among his people. And this is really the first, the first religious affiliation, culture, whatever you want to say, that has a God that literally dwells among them. Now, for us today, it's a little bit different in that we believe that we have a God who has dwelled among us as one of us, as Jesus, and also through the Holy Spirit, which is still among us. So this is a completely foreign concept to everyone who would have been there, though, and that's what they say. The gods do not dwell among mortals. Well, Daniel has something else to say about that. And what's interesting about it is Daniel hears about this because the king gets so mad that he's going to have all these guys killed. But Daniel plays his cards very well. And why is the king ordering this? And what's happening? And well, let me go talk to him first. And because of that, he is able to not only tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream is, he's also able to interpret it for him. And this is a dream of prophecy that God is revealing to Nebuchadnezzar about what's coming in history. That the statue that's made up of different materials represents the different empires that will come and go. And Daniel tells him of this, and he's like, "Oh, you're really, really wise. So you're going to stay in my court, and your other three guys will be important as well." From there, we switch into the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, commonly or lovingly called Rack, Shack, and Benny, if you are familiar with Veggie Tales, and we called them that last night. But their story, now this is the first situation where they're called to worship a god that they refuse to do. Now, the Nebuchadnezzar, we don't know how much time has passed between Daniel interpreting this dream for him and now this happening. We're not given that passage of time, that indicator. Does it happen right away? Is it later on? We don't know. Where's Daniel during this particular portion? Again, we don't know. So it's probably happening later on in that 70 years, but when exactly, we don't know. Regardless, he has this statue made, and it's thought that it's probably an obelisk, which is like a big square pointed thing, kind of like the Washington Monument. If you're familiar with that, that would be an obelisk. But it's 90 feet high, 9 feet wide, and it's made of gold. So it's this great big thing. And he issues this decree that anytime you hear the music of such and such and such, and it repeats over and over and over again, everyone must bow down to it. And everyone does, except Rack, Shack, and Benny, who refuse to do that because they see that as breaking the first commandment. God says, "You shall have no other gods before me." They refuse, and they get in trouble for it. Some of the other officials who seem to be jealous of them come to the king, and they're like, "Hey, didn't you say that anytime you hear the music, you have to bow down?" Well, these three guys don't do it. And so he calls him in. He says, "Is this true that you don't do it? Prove it to me now. You can bow down now, and everything will be fine." And they say no. And so he gets so mad that and his decree was that anyone who doesn't do this will be thrown into the fiery furnace. He gets so mad at him for defying him in this one thing that he orders that the furnace be heated up 7 times hotter than normal. It's so hot that the people who are carrying them tied up die because of the heat, and they fall in. And suddenly Nebuchadnezzar looks in and sees it, which raises the question, has time passed? And so it's cooled down. Is that why he can look in there? But he looks in and sees 4 figures. He says, "Didn't we throw 3 guys in there? I see 4, and one of them looks like a son of the gods." Son of the gods is an interesting little phrase. It probably means an angel, or what they would understand to be an angel. But we hear son of God, and we think, Jesus, is this a divine, a pre-shadow or foreshadowed image of the yet not human Jesus? We don't know. We don't know. But regardless, the 3 guys come out, and the only thing that's happened is they're the ropes that had tied them were gone, had burned away likely. But their clothes are fine, their hair is fine. There's not even the smell of fire and smoke upon them. So they've been miraculously saved. Nebuchadnezzar's like, wow, your God is pretty awesome. And he puts out a decree. No one can speak ill of the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. At that point, those three guys kind of disappear, and we don't hear about them anymore. So we don't know if they eventually die. We don't know if they just kind of go off and do their own thing. We don't. But regardless, their story is now done, and we transfer back to Daniel. Now Daniel goes through another situation. Nebuchadnezzar has another dream, and once again Daniel interprets it. Really doesn't want to, because the interpretation of this dream is that, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to go crazy. You're literally going to lose your mind, and you're going to live like an animal for a long time. They say it's like seven times. They think maybe it's 7 years. We don't know exactly know. But and lo and behold, it happens. He loses his mind and goes off into the wilderness. And his son Belshazzar, I think is what his name is. It's one of those weird pronunciations. He's named as king, and we hear that. We hear of King Belteshazzar. And but it's thought that he was like king regent, so he was basically filling in as ruler while dad's off in the wilderness. Nuts. So there's this thing going on. He throws a big banquet, and the hand of God appears and does writing on the wall. And Daniel alone is able to understand the writing and say what it means. And so there's that story that's in there, and it's talked about in within the chapter, but kind of just in passing. So it's not really hit upon heavily. Then Nebuchadnezzar comes back and kind of comes back into the story, and they kind of go back and forth a little bit more. And then it fast forwards until the Persians are there, and we hear that King Cyrus now is the one, or Darius is the one who ends up throwing Daniel in the lion's den. Probably what Daniel's the best known for. What's interesting to note is that Daniel, as a high-ranking official in the king's court from the Babylonians, is allowed to not only live when the Persians take over, but maintains that position of prominence. It speaks very greatly to the prominence that he had and the way that God was blessing him, despite being in this foreign area. Typically, when a new power came in, they killed everyone, or they hauled them off into exile somewhere else, but they definitely would not leave them in power. Daniel, though, as an official, remains in power, and that's definitely important to take note of. But then we go into the lion's den, and it's once again basically the same situation as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that there's this, that people are jealous of him, and they know that he prays only to God, and he has not accepted the Babylonian gods, or now the Persian gods. So they trick the king, Cyrus, into basically making a decree that, hey, for the next month, you can't bow down to anyone except me. And as emperor, I'm a representative of the gods anyway, so it makes sense for you to worship me. And he's like, yeah, that's a good idea. So he makes this decree, and then lo and behold, Daniel is still like, well, I'm going to still pray to God because God is God. And he gets caught and says, well, okay, yeah, I did. I'm not going to bow down to you. And so even though the king doesn't want to do it because he seems to be very, very enamored with Daniel, who's by now got to be an old man, he gets thrown into the lion's den because they can't reverse his decision. But and he's in there overnight, and of course the angel of the Lord protects him. And the next morning, Cyrus or Darius comes back and says, Daniel, has your God protected you? And Daniel's like, yep, I'm good, and I have not done any harm against you. So they pull him out, and all the people who set Daniel up get thrown in there along with their families and children, and they all get killed by the lions. So the lions get their meal too. And once again, we hear that now the new king is impressed by and influenced by Daniel. So that's what happens in the chapter. We talked some about what's the upper story that's going on. We see, despite the fact that the people have lost the promised land, they've been hauled off into exile. They've been given the promise through the prophets that this will not last forever. You will come home, and some of them do, and that's actually what's in the chapter for next time. But some of them will, and we think perhaps it's because of the great influence of Daniel impressing Cyrus, that Cyrus is then the king who allows the people to go back to the promised land. But we don't know. That's just some speculation. But that sense is definitely there. But we see that God continues to influence some very high-ranking people through the Jewish people. We have Daniel, we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who all are great influencers in the Babylonian and then into the Persian Empire. Coming up, we'll also hear about Esther. That's in chapter 20, so a couple weeks from now. Esther and her cousin Mordecai, who are also high-ranking officials within the Persian Empire. So there are definitely some influencers in there, and we think this is probably evidence of what God told Abraham clear back when, that I will make of you a great nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through you. So that's really what's happening in this week. And wow, I got long-winded. I crossed the 20-minute mark, and that's I think the first time that's happened. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. If you have thoughts, questions, comments from your reading of the story or things that this has sparked off for you, please share those down in the comment section. We can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, have a great week. There will not be a video next week as I am off, but we'll be back in 2 weeks with chapter 19. Otherwise, have a great couple of weeks and God bless.